Parasympathetic fibers are all over the brain, and it's arguably one of the most confusing things when you're studying cranial nerves and head and neck anatomy. So hopefully in this video we're going to clarify where all these parasympathetic fibers are. And one of the reasons parasympathetic fibers are slightly confusing is because they will start off in one nerve and then they'll synapse at a ganglion and get picked up by another nerve. So that's kind of the big picture idea, and I think if you can grasp that, that's gonna really help. So again, let me just repeat that a parasympathetic fiber will start off in one nerve, it'll synapse at a ganglion, and then it gets acquired or picked up by a different nerve. So where do parasympathetic fibers usually begin? They're going to begin in cranial nerves 3, 7, and 9. So parasympathetic fibers always begin either in 3, 7, or 9. So let's go one at a time and see what happens. So the first parasympathetic fiber that you'll see is it starts off in cranial nerve 3, which is the oculomotor nerve, and that's represented by this blue line here. And it's going to synapse at the ciliary ganglion. This is so what I've drawn here is basically your head. So let me just clarify. Here's your eye is probably right around here. So that's your eye. Maybe your nose is here. It's a very ugly looking head, obviously, but just to give you some perspective. So this is sort of the top of your head. So it's going to synapse in the ciliary ganglion, which is really right next to your eye. And then cranial nerve 5, the trigeminal nerve, part 1, so that's the ophthalmic branch of cranial nerve 5, is going to acquire that parasympathetic nerve. So really after it synapses, right, cranial nerve 3 is going to continue to go, it's going to synapse, and cranial nerve 3 is going to continue to keep going, but this part of cranial nerve 3 will not have parasympathetic fibers, okay? So that's why I kind of stopped it. So only this part is going to have the parasympathetic fiber in it, and then 5-1 is going to pick it up. And likewise, right, let me just also, let's get this color here. Likewise, 5-1 also begins, somewhere, it's going to come from the beginning, but the beginning part of it will not have any parasympathetic fiber innervation, only the part after this synapsing at this ganglion, then it has parasympathetic fiber innervation. And why do we need to know all this? The reason we need to know all this is because if you have damage to one of these nerves, you want to see, is the parasympathetic fiber going to be damaged as well? So imagine a patient comes in and the patient has damage right here. Okay, so there's some sort of damage to this cranial nerve 5-1 at this section. So then you would ask yourself, okay, what do I expect to look for clinically for some symptoms, right? And we know 5-1 is sort of the major, it does the sensory innervation of your sort of forehead and right above your eyes. So you would say, okay, I expect that the patient won't be able to see, or I'm sorry, won't be able to sense right, in my forehead area. Would I expect them to not have parasympathetic fibers also not working? And the answer is no, right? Because there's no parasympathetic fibers in this beginning portion, you would expect that all the parasympathetic fibers to still be working properly. But if there's a lesion right here after the ganglion, then not only would you lose sensory innervation, which is what 5-1 does, you would also lose parasympathetic innervation from this part right here, whatever this parasympathetic fiber does. So that's why that's why we need to know all this, because whenever you have lesions of these nerves, you have to ask yourself, is the parasympathetic fiber being compromised? So I'm going to get rid of all this, and let's just walk through the rest of the parasympathetic fibers. So let's look at number 2. So I actually didn't label these, so let me just make it very clear. This is talking about number 1, this is talking about 2, 3, and 4. So the second one is the parasympathetic fiber, so I just wrote PF for parasympathetic fiber, is going to begin in the greater petrosal branch of cranial nerve 7. So the greater petrosal branch of cranial nerve 7. So cranial nerve 7 is going to branch into, it's going to have many different branches, and this branch specifically is what carries the parasympathetic fiber. It's going to travel, it's going to synapse as something called the pterygopalatine ganglion, and then 5-2 is going to acquire it after its synapses, okay? And same clinical thing, right? If there's a damage right here, then you know that the parasympathetic fiber is also going to be compromised, and it won't be functioning if you have a damage after this ganglion on 5-2. But if the damage is before the ganglion on 5-2, then you will not be compromising parasympathetics. Number 3 is sort of down here, and the parasympathetic fiber is the chorda tympani branch of cranial nerve 7. So notice cranial nerve 7 carries 2 different parasympathetic fibers. This is specifically the chorda tympani branch of cranial nerve 7. It's going to synapse at something called the submandibular ganglion, and that makes somewhat sense, right? Because the mandible is your jaw, and sub means below, so it's below the jaw, and that's why it's kind of down here on my head. And that's going to get acquired by, so when we say acquired, it just means, it's picked up after this ganglion by cranial nerve 5-3, okay? So 5-3 is going to pick it up after here. And lastly, you have a parasympathetic fiber in cranial nerve 9, so that's parasympathetic in cranial nerve 9, synapses at the otic ganglion, and then gets acquired by cranial nerve 5-3. So if you ever get a question, right, and this is it. These are the cranial nerves that do parasympathetic innervation in your entire head. Okay, so if you ever get a question, right, like what nerves do parasympathetic innervation in your head, the easiest way to think about it, this is how I always think about it. I always think of it as 3, 7, 7, and 9 do they initially carry the parasympathetics, right? And I wrote 7 twice because there's 2 separate branches for 7. So 3, 7, 7, 9 are my initial, they carry the initial parasympathetic fibers. And what acquires parasympathetic fibers is always trigeminal. So that makes it kind of easy, right? That cranial nerve 5, the trigeminal nerve, always is going to acquire your parasympathetic fibers. So 3, 7, 7, 9 is going to start it off, and then 5 is going to pick it up at the end. And that's it. That's what does your parasympathetics in your head. Now, there's one more thing that might slightly confuse you, right? Cranial nerve 10, so I should be writing all of these in Roman numerals here, but anyways. So let me just stick to normal numbers for now. So cranial nerve 10, you will read in textbooks, also has parasympathetic fibers, okay? So I'm not going to, well, now that I've started, I might as well finish it. So parasympathetics, cranial nerve 10. So you might be asking yourself, where's cranial nerve 10, right? How come I didn't draw cranial nerve 10 in this diagram? And it is true that cranial nerve 10 does have parasympathetic fibers. However, these parasympathetic fibers of cranial nerve 10 only do parasympathetics in the thorax and abdomen. They don't actually do parasympathetics in your head. So if someone asks you, which cranial nerves have parasympathetics, then you would say 3, 7, 7, 9, and I guess you would also say 10 technically does have parasympathetics, but I would put a little star next to it because even though it has parasympathetics, it doesn't actually do any parasympathetics in your head. It only does it in thorax and abdomen. So what actually does parasympathetics in your head are 3, 7, 7, 9, and then 5 takes it over. And then 10, yes, technically does have parasympathetics, but it's only going to do it in your thorax and abdomen. So hopefully hopefully you can see why this is a slightly confusing topic, but now we've kind of made it hopefully much more clear what all those parasympathetics are in the cranial nerves.